One last consideration for observational studies is avoiding bias. So we first need to start with this idea of what is bias. So bias, in the context of sampling, is the tendency for our samples to differ from the corresponding population in some systematic way. It could result from the way that the sample was selected, or maybe from the way that the information is obtained once the sample has been chosen. So let's look at some specific types of bias that we could have. So the first kind of bias I want us to look at is this idea of selection bias. You get selection bias when the way the sample is selected systematically excludes some part of the population of interest. We talked earlier with the sampling frame, sometimes not including everybody in the population. Well, that would be an example of selection bias. For some reason, you've excluded some of the population. Every 10 years, the United States does the U.S. Census, and it's always challenging to make sure that every single person in the United States is included in this census. But there's some people that are just a little bit harder to find. People who are homeless, for example, would not always be in the same location, and so it would be difficult for us to locate them. There's other groups that might be avoiding being counted in the census, but those people are important for us to have data on. So selection bias is going to occur anytime that we just can't get everybody in our sample. Selection bias also can occur in those voluntary response samples because only people who want to participate actually do participate. And so that could be excluding some people from the population simply because they did not want to participate in the study. Another type of bias is measurement or response bias. And we get this when our method of observation tends to produce values that systematically differ from the true value in some way. So you could think of this as a scale that was calibrated incorrectly. Now, every time you placed an item on the scale, it would be, say, 2 pounds too light for every observation. But those are incorrect because they're off by 2 pounds. So a measurement bias typically will be in the same way for all of the observations, but they are incorrect. And then our non-response bias. This happens when our responses are not obtained from all individuals selected in the sample. Now, this is different from selection bias because selection bias, the actual collection of the sample, is eliminating or excluding some individuals in the population. The non-response bias happens once the sample is selected if data from the individuals in the sample could not be obtained. So this can happen in an observational study where people don't turn in their surveys, or if people choose not to respond. In surveys, non-response is going to happen at least to some degree in almost every survey, but you want to make sure that the non-response is low, otherwise there could be something going on that you would need to consider when trying to describe the entire population. One way that we can prevent non-response bias is by ensuring that we are following up with everybody that's selected for our sample.